Gurave Gaurachandra Radhikaya Tadali Krishnaya Krishna Bhaktaya Tad Bhaktaya Namo Namaha Vanchakalpatrubhyascha Kripa Sindhuvevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Mandanvat Pranam devotees. So trying to stay consistent with the flow of Srimad Baghavatam 12th Canto to kind of get through the verses that we want to cover. I'm going to do a little bit today. I'm actually getting a late start. Also, Madhavatiti Ekadasi Ki Jai. Today is Ekadasi, so with my Vrat and other services, I want to kind of spend time in the other things that I have to do. So I want to, though, do something in continuum of what we've been speaking about. So I'll see if I can get through one or two more verses today and give some insight from those verses by the mercy of Sri Guru Parampara and lotus feet of my Guru Pada Padma. So we, I believe, left off in the last session with verse number 3. So now we're on verse number 4. Lingam evasrama kyatyav ananyo pati karanam avrityanyay durbhavyam panditye chapalam vacha. So lingam here means the symbolism, external symbolism. Eva, certainly. Ashrama kayatao. In knowing a person's spiritual order. In other words, what category of life a person is in Vedic culture was very apparent by certain symptoms. And those symptoms were their external dress and their external activities. And on the basis of that, you could tell who was Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Sudra, etc. Right? And even you could tell also who's Brahmachari, Grahastha, Vanprast, or Sannyasi. So because the Vedic system was based in the model of Varnashram Dharma, which here Srila Bhakti-Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur has mentioned, Daivi Varnashram. Not Varnashram Dharma, but Daivi Varnashram. Because the purpose of the social arrangement is to facilitate service to God. So in that way, the Varnashram system is divine. Chatur Varyam Mari system Guna Karma Vibhavasho. Krishna himself has designed the Varnashram system as a mechanism for the social fabric to all be engaged in service. So, of course, if you disconnect the Varnashram system from its purpose and from its divine original characteristic bestowed by God, then it becomes a caste system, right? And just like anything else, which once it is divorced from the absolute truth, it can become exploited. So in the same way, divorced from or separated from the absolute truth, then Varnashram system can appear or be manipulated or socially engineered as a caste system. So Srila Bhakti-Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur was very clear to make the point that actually Varnashram Dharma means Daivi Varnashram Dharma. That Varnashram Dharma which was related to Bhagavan. So in Vedic culture, Lingam evasrama kayatao. You could tell what ashram a person belonged to, and the appropriate social dealings with that person could therefore take place. So if it was seen that there was some incongruent social dealing, a renunciant with a woman in private, a Kshatriya dressed in sannyas, dressed and purporting to be a sadhu, or more to the point, which will come up a little later on, which is a very prominent verse in this whole series of verses, that those who are outside the category of Vedic designation, meaning they're not really living out human life, though they have a human body. So Yavana, Malechas, these were not only designations for races of people, and in fact they didn't specifically so much point to the racial designation of people, but to their status in relation to Daivi Varnashram Dharma. So those who are outside of that we'll call Malechas or Yavanas or etc. So if you see that someone who's even outside of the category of Varnashram Dharma is imitating or trying to take a position artificially from the quality of being a Malecha Yavana or etc., take up a position within Varnashram Dharma, right? I'll just go ahead and reveal it. Later on there's going to be one verse that says, Prajaste Vasikshanti Malecha Rajana Rupina. That in the Kali Yuga, those who are Malecha, means outcast of Daivi Varnashram, who are Raja Rupina, in the imitative position of being rulers, because of their nature, will tax the citizens until they are so distressed that they'll run for the hills. You understand? So, of course, all of these things, we're literally seeing them, and if we put on the glasses of Srimad Baghavatam, we'll see them clearly, as opposed to maybe perhaps reading, Srimad Baghavatam is more of a narrative or a novel, you understand? Or just some ancient scriptural text, right, related to that time, because I think I mentioned in the very first series that the word Purana, this is the Bhagavat Purana, and Purana means Pura Api Navam. Pura means what is ancient, but Api, although it is ancient, Navam, it has current or present application, ever new applications. You understand? So, in that verse it says, such malechas imitating kings will tax citizens and create such distress in the populace that people will run for shelter in other places. Of course, this became a popular theme in inspiring devotees to try to develop self-sufficient communities and to work on Varnashram Dharma, and that's why many devotees gave so much emphasis to certain statements of Srila Prabhupada regarding that. Of course, Srila Prabhupada's main emphasis for the devotee community and the establishment of bhakti in the West was to distribute love of God. This was the pinnacle and the greater purpose of Srila Prabhupada's establishment of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. So to give especially that great gift that Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu brought in this Kali Yuga, Anapita Chirim Chirat Kanunavati Nakalo, Sumutpaitam Unata Ujwala Rasa Subhakti Sriyam. This is the pinnacle of spiritual attainment. The understanding of the nature of the love of Radha for Krishna and the ability to understand how to render service to that love is the height of all spiritual attainment. And even though it has appeared in the Kali Yuga, this Kali Yuga is called Danya Kali because of that purpose. Danya means a great gift, because even though this is speaking spiritually, like if this was a spiritual climate, it is the worst of the climatic conditions to try to execute spiritual life in. But at the same time, in this particular Kali Yuga, which is coming the 28th day of Lord Brahma, right, when Krishna will appear in the Dwarapa Yuga, and then Sriman Mahaprabhu will appear in the Kali Yuga preceding, after that, right, then this Kali Yuga is extremely special and extremely rare, right? I think I spoke about that in the first video, so I will not go back into that. But here, anyway, it's mentioning that by external sign, a person's status will be ascertained, right? So now you can find that there are people who they may present themselves, and lingam here doesn't mean only the external physical dress, but it means the presentation they give, right? The presentation they give may give a person the idea that they're highly qualified persons. But remember, we've lost our absolute metric. We can't even describe what it means to be qualified as a human being. Of course, Scripture qualifies what a human being is. Atato Brahma Jigyasa. Those who realize that they're in the human form of life, and therefore the purpose is to inquire into the absolute truth. So Sastra, it determines what is human life, but those who are not in that pursuit, what is their status? They have human form, so they're presenting as a human being. But remember, in the species of humans, right, there are 400,000 different levels of consciousness within the human spectrum, right? So it does not mean that everyone who presents a human form is actually even fully qualified human being. When do you become qualified to be a human being? When you ask the question, who am I and why am I suffering? Because this question, it's called mati. It's the point of discrimination that arises in a person when the inspiration for self-discovery and self-realization come about, right? And then they question their existence here. That's the symptom. Atato Brahma Jigyasa. Inquiry into the truth is the symptom of human life. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur has written other than that. It's called Dvipada Pasu. There are persons who are presenting themselves as human beings, but they have two legs, means they walk on two legs, but Dvipada Pasu. But their behavior is still within the category of animal consciousness. Because animal consciousness, ahara, nidra, bhoya, maitunam, eating, sleeping, mating, and defending are the qualities of animal life. If the sophistication of those four things reaches the greatest degree, it doesn't change the fact that it's still within that realm of consciousness. So even if the person substitutes, simply eating off of the ground, like some animals may do, with fine dining at a fine restaurant and accompanied by fine music, it doesn't change eating. You understand? What will change eating is the idea of foodstuffs being offered to Bhagavan and Seva, and then being able to have the prasad, or the mercy of Bhagavan imbued, in that foodstuff, and honoring it. This is all part of spiritual practice. That can be considered spiritual activity. Simply eating, right? And the purpose of, and my point here was, it's the purpose of human life. So the honoring of prasad is not just eating. It's the actual part of the purpose of human life. Simply eating foodstuffs is part of the animal kingdom. And the same goes for simply sleeping, simply mating, or perpetuating the existence of human beings. Right? I mentioned it could be divine service in the last video, but that's when it is connected to the practice of spiritual life. Dharma virudeshu kamosmi bhatashaba. But just random engagement in sex life that, on a lottery basis may produce a child, and then when you produce that child, if the child is not wanted by both parents or either parent, then you have an elective to do away with the life of the child. This is sinful life. It is not only animal life, but it is sinful life. Because even in the animal kingdom, right, in rare occasions, do you find that even animals kill their young. So how this could become a normative psychology in so-called human society is unfathomable. You understand? Now, generally when you bring up this subject matter, and I don't want to go into this subject matter in any detail because the video is not about that, and I don't want the video sidetracked to be about that, but it is a very heavy karmic weight on the society at large that there is a normalcy in the psychology around aborting the life of children in the womb. And the covering of that activity by disingenuous titling, such as healthcare, or titling it choice, because nobody is questioning the choices that a person makes. They're questioning the nature of aborting the life process. Every single person who's here came through that process. If anybody came immaculately, please let me know. If not, we all came through that life process. So that life process is a divine thing. And do we have a right, which we obviously in the social fabric at large, we don't express that. Well, I don't think the viability of this person in society is very good, so let's do away with them. You cannot even take your own life, right? People do, but normally if it's discovered, then people will obviously do an intervention and you'll be asked to, go for evaluation as to your psychological or mental state, etc., because we see life as something divine, even if you don't acknowledge divinity, and we see a certain intrinsic value in it. So how is it that the very process which produces that end result could be seen differently. Only when social engineering takes place and it's couched again as something which is not the real issue under discussion. The issue under discussion is not what choices a person makes. People choose whom to be intimate with, when to be intimate. And even in one sense, if they're going to be intimate without any kind of situation which would prevent pregnancy, we don't advocate that, obviously, as devotees, but even that choice is there. The choice post the activity is there. I don't particularly want to have a child at this time. I'm going to give the child up for adoption. But why would we normalize the process of just simply killing the child? So that psychology is a karmic debt on the entire society. Because if the society at large is made to voluntarily or involuntarily be contributors via taxes or whatever it might be to supporting that, then you get some of that karma. I remember Srila Prabhupada once wrote, a person who kills the animal, sells the animal, purchases the animal, transports the animal, obviously eats the animal, they're all implicated in the activities of the sin of killing a cow. You understand? They're all implicated by any one of those different mechanisms. So we don't want to be even vicariously connected to supporting the idea of killing children in the womb. You understand? I don't know, and this has been something that, again, I don't do politics and so forth, but when devotees were writing me for an opinion on those things, some devotees actually wrote with the parlance and with the mindset of one political side or another around that issue. And I wrote them back personally, the issue is not really a political one. It is one that you have to look at the humanness, the factor of humanness regarding it, what to speak of looking at it through the prism of your spiritual ideal. And there's no spiritual ideal, whether it is in any particular religious practice, that condones or accepts that idea. So I don't know where or how that is something that could be rationalized in the mind of anyone who's on the practice or in the practice or aspiration in the practice of bhakti. I'm just not sure where that's come from. Now also, so many times there's so much conflation with the issue, right? And for instance, people will bring up that it appears to be incompassionate if you don't consider the emotional state of a woman going through that particular very difficult decision. So the problem is the lack of compassion is not really an argument, because it doesn't mean a person does not have compassion because they don't agree with the idea being presented. If you present the idea, well, we should kill the child in the womb, but I need compassion for myself because I'm going to make this choice. No, compassion may be there for you because the choice to even have it in your mind is very difficult, right? Because it's not an intrinsic mood. We don't have an intrinsic relationship with death that, well, death is not a big thing. And even people who very boisterously speak like that, when they're confronted with it, then you'll see that there's a difference. You understand? It's just like, and I don't want to get so far off subject matter. I'm going to try to bring it back in the subject matter. But obviously everybody knows I had a career in law enforcement. And part of that career is you run into very dangerous situations, including life and death type of scenarios. And you can see that many people don't have the fortitude to confront things like that. I was in the military, thank God it was the end of Vietnam, so I didn't have to go to Vietnam. But you'll speak to people who are in law enforcement or military situations, or just who, happen to have run across a life and death situation, and you'll find that it's not normative to have a congenial relationship with the idea of death and killing and so forth and so on. So how that's coming into a framework of being normalized for the most vulnerable of the population who don't have a particular idea to defend themselves. I mean, things that I went through in law enforcement, I had an option of defending myself, you understand? And therefore, by training and the tools to defend myself, there can be some bravery around taking life and death situations. But what about the situation of a child in the womb? You understand? So there's not a lack of compassion either for the woman or the father, because there's also this heavy subplot of alienating the father from the situation, though the father is an equal contributor to the reality of that life that's there. But there's this sort of subplot of alienating the man as though, well, he has nothing to do with it. It's all about the woman in this case. No, that was an activity that was arranged by the combination of a man and a woman. You understand? It was not a singular event. You understand? So compassion should be there for both, but compassion in many cases is truth. It is illumination. It is compassion by giving remedy in an absolute way to something that is obviously not congruent with or resonant with our humanness. So to give illumination of why it's not, why you don't feel good about this, and for those who come to a psychology of, I have no problem with aborting the baby, right? Then that is a problem itself if your psychological state has reached such a point that you could, in ease, abort the life of the most vulnerable in the population with no problems or issues or concerns or whatever, right? You should think that is concerning. You understand? Of course, the people who speak like that, have given rationale that it's not life, and they start to get into embryology and biology and so forth and so on. But when all the smoke and mirrors have passed, and you ask very directly, well, did you come here through that process? And are you not what you are now because of that process? Did you somehow or another skip over that process, and therefore it's not really a life process? It's something else? So, anyway, again, I think I'm going too far down the pike. But no, there is compassion for the mother and extreme also compassion for that vulnerable child. You understand? Who's in or that soul who's now in the life process. You understand? So my original point was that if we become so out of sync with the absolute truth that we cannot recognize who's who in the society, and therefore we end up in such a convoluted social dynamic because there is no true sense of leadership, because we can't identify who's truly a leader. You understand? What is the basis of being a leader? What's the criteria? If the criteria is relative, and according to the last verse we read, a person is glorified in society if they have money and power, then even if the person has money and power, but they're complete debauchery regarding character and other sort of things, and I don't mean the relative idea. I don't mean the relative idea. Because as we're going to read here, a person may present themselves in a very, in a fashion of being very high class and very situated in terms of character and morality, but in fact, they are a complete manifestation of walking hypocrisy and duplicity. You understand? So you can't judge just by always external activity. You have to look at the sort of life activity of that person. You understand? So anyway, lingam evasrama kyayato, not being able to tell simply by external presentation who's who in society. Ananyapati karanam. Apati. Any kind of, let me read the English. A person's spiritual position will be ascertained merely according to external symbols, right? Means how they're situated in Varshranam Dharma. And on the same basis, people will change from one spiritual order to the next. So here, the idea is that people really even take up the practice of spirituality on a superficial basis. I'm not going to go into detail because I did that on the last video. Generally, the ahamkara is the housing of our karmic portfolio. That means the culmination of whatever activities we've done in the past life and the activities and desires playing out in this life are all housed in the ahamkar, false egoism. False egoism is imbued with the three modes of material nature. So essentially, that sort of interplay between false egoism, the false identity we have in our material karmic iteration, and the three modes of material nature playing out constant dramas. And even when a person enters into so-called search for spiritual truth or spirituality or religion or anything else, so in many cases they carry, as I mentioned in the other video, that prospect, not that prospect, but those properties of the false egoism. So they simply come into a spiritual practice, and for some times they, by self-interest, drink up or consume whatever is spiritually appropriate, and when they run into any actual ideal of needing to surrender or become genuine in that process and it's not satisfied, they simply jump to another. So people are constantly changing their religious perspective, constantly changing their faith, right? I was Muslim, but then I became Christian, but then I decided to join the Hare Krishnas. Or I was Hare Krishna, but because of various things I became Christian. You understand? So these are all symptomatic of this feature. In addition to simply making external presentation, lingam eva srama kayato ananyopati karanam, right? Avichanyaya dhul balyam. That a person will simply change their spiritual order whimsically, based in self-interest. Because any spiritual practice is meant to give illumination that is a realization that turns into a spiritual experience. That spiritual experience is not something you can come back from. If you put your hand on a fire and get burnt, you can't come back from that knowledge and then again see fire and say, oh, let me put my hand in there. So if you're genuinely doing any spiritual practice and it has become realization and experience, you don't back up from that. You understand? Now once you experience something, that's not lost. That's a permanent thing. But if the association with the spiritual practice was superficial, you understand, like it's being mentioned here, was superficial, then according to your self-interest, your karmic portfolio, influences the modes of nature, you change from one spiritual position to another. Not only that, but within the particular spiritual practice you had, the same kind of changes may take place. I remember some months ago, I began commenting on some posts that dealt with ideas about bhakti and the need for reformation in bhakti, updating of bhakti, review of the efficacies of bhakti based on certain various self-interest considerations. So I was writing and thinking, writing and expressing, first, be sure that you've had contact with pure bhakti. Because if pure bhakti is swatta siddha, it is fully accomplished in and of itself, what improvement will you make to pure bhakti? If you've not had that experience, then you cannot ascertain that any adjustment should be made, which when you do have that experience, you realize there's nothing to be adjusted in bhakti, but there's something to be adjusted in me in relation to pure bhakti. The absolute standard is perfect. My perspective in relation to the absolute standard may need to be adjusted. So I'm pointing this out because even within a particular spiritual tradition, people may vacillate from one position to another, even within that spiritual paradigm. Understand? Panditye chapalam bacha. Finally, panditye means any scholar, right? Scholarship will be ascertained by the ability to, chapala means unsteady or flickering, but here the translation is tricky. Vachaha. By being able to speak in such a way that nobody really knows what you're talking about, therefore it must be deep. So giving an example, many years ago, while I was working in music, we had a performance with a group of poets, who were very famous poets actually. I think they were Grammy awarded poets. But anyway, waiting for the time of our performance, we heard them doing their poetry recitations. So, there's a lot of emotion and a lot of, vocal dynamics and everything. But then when you really got down to the nuts and bolts of what was being said, it really was a lot of words being spewed out. But, really, it's like, what was the context? What was the purpose? What's the basis? It's like the words coupled with the emotional expression of the words, coupled with an audience who perhaps is into the aesthetics of just poetry on the basis of the floweriness of the language or the ability for it to rhyme in some cases. In this case, it wasn't even so much about the rhyme as much as it was about the emotional presentation of the words. At any rate, the idea became people had this deep sigh, oh. But I was thinking, well, what was the meaning of everything, right? A similar case could be made for art. Now, obviously, if you're an artist and you've studied, you may be able to look at a painting and discern that the symmetry and the particular color nuances all line up to be a certain thing. But in general, this is one of the things about fine art, so to speak. You go and look at something, and it's just a dot on a piece of paper. And there's people standing around, and they're looking at it like, wow, very amazing, wonderful, woo, wow. Right? So what happens is that like a whole subculture is created that creates an aesthetic around something, and it sets up an idea that we'll have a mutual appreciation society of this thing, even though factually speaking, it has no meaning, right? So it doesn't really stir the soul, right? And even when you hear people use words like that, it stirred my soul. What they're really talking about was, it stirred my false egoism, which then stimulated my intelligence, which then the mind accepted as, oh yeah, this is something that tastes good, according to material standards, right? And people are unable to differentiate what that is from what a genuine spiritual experience is that's born from actual transcendental substance, which then unfolds in the heart and gives a spiritual experience. You understand? So even in spiritual context, people who have the ability, and I'm not speaking, some devotees are just, they have some skill in being able to put their words together nicely. They're very good orators, so forth and so on. And the basis of trying to understand if they fit this category or not will really be based on what's the substance of their own personal bhajan life and their personal devotional life, right? The same holds true for a person who's not great in oration. They don't have great oratory skills, but their practice of bhakti is very deep. On our phone conference the other night, it came up about the glory of Srila Gaura Das Babaji. That sometimes we hear, oh, he was illiterate. He was not illiterate. He was the master of all knowledge because he had full realization. He's Guna Manjari. You understand? It was explained by the nature of his bhajan, he was holding back the influence of Kali Yuga. You understand? So we should understand very clearly that here it means, for instance, any number of spiritual societies, you can go and you'll hear people speak, and it'll simply be a presentation that's appealing to the sensibilities of false egoism. And once the false ego is appeased, it gives the co-signing to, yes, this is wonderful, right? Just like Mayavad philosophy to some degree, which finds manifestation in so many different societies and so forth. Yes, we're all one with the absolute energy, right? So it appeals to the false egoism in the sense that it says I'm not really the person who's suffering day to day. Now I'm in the environment of other people who mutually all consenting that we're one with the absolute energy. Now, if you start breaking down and defining that, that could be very helpful. But if you leave it in that vague, undefined status, it's simply an aleve or temporary pain reliever for the false egoism. You understand? The suffering that naturally arises in life, adhyatmika, adibhautika, adidaivic, right? Miseries caused by one's own body and mind, those caused by interactions with others, and those caused by natural arrangements through the devatas, right? So some temporary relief through the pain reliever of various kinds of association with people who spew out a bunch of words that pacify the false egoism, right? I'm sure people can think of a variety of different situations like that, but basically that's what it's addressing here. And overall, it's addressing the fact of what I presented in the very first class, that if you look, once you lose the absolute standard, what is Dharma? Dharma in that particular verse means Bhagwan. Then Satyam, what is absolute truth, the answer to every question, the answer to every situation, the absolute conclusive perspective, the end of all search for causation about what is what. That's called Satyam. When that's established, the basis of Socham, what is pure, what is real, what is impure, contaminated by the unreal. You understand? All of that can be ascertained. But if it becomes relative, then the truth becomes relative. Then what is the standard of purity, or the pure reality becomes convoluted. And in that particular situation, only the individual perspectives and subjective karmic experiences become dominant. And when that becomes dominant, obviously because everybody's karmic portfolio is different, then there'll be conflictual arrangements which will give rise to kshama, intolerance, right? And that intolerance will give rise to a lack of daya or mercy. You understand? So we have to take the very first verse that was presented here and see how the other verses, they're called Sangati. This is Adhyay Sangati. Adhyay means a chapter, Sangati. And it also has Sastra Sangati because it's connected to all the Srimad Baghavatam, also how I spoke on the first day. But here it's describing all the different features that are the outgrowth from the relativizing of the absolute truth or the ostracizing of absolute truth from the social fabric, which is the prominent feature of this particular spiritual climatic condition called Kali Yuga. Right? And those who imbibe or allow their consciousness to be permeated by these things, they, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, have called them Kali Chelas. They become disciples of Kali. You understand? And as those who are disciples of absolute truth, coming in Guru Parampara, our mission, commission, and duty is to, with compassion and tolerance, be able to illuminate the absolute truth as it has come down in Parampara and through Sastra, Guru Sadhu and Sastra, to illuminate the social environment that we find ourselves in at this time, right? And this doesn't mean becoming a champion of a cause. This simply means doing your bhajan, because the potency in what you say is directly linked to the potency in your bhajan, sudden practice and realizations, etc. Become thick and steeped in that, and then simply speak out truly to the broadest audience you can, the truth. And then the like if you pour water on top of a mountain, the shape of the mountain has many different curves and plateaus and so forth. So if you speak the truth from the absolute perspective, the top of that mountain, it'll come down the mountain according to the various curvatures and plateaus, etc. of that mountain. So similarly, everybody's particular individual life is like that mountain. And the water of what you speak in the form of Harikatha, it will come down that mountain and it will go into the curvatures and so forth of that person according to the shape of their karmic portfolio. And that's all you can do. You understand? That's the limit of what you can do. You understand? So I'm going to end the video here because, again, it's Ekadasi here on the East Coast. I think on the West Coast it was Ekadasi yesterday, and for them it's Dwadasi. But I'll end so that I can go ahead with some other services. All right, my Dandavat Pranam, Dandavat Sadhan Siddha Prabhu, Vriksha Prabhu, Lakshman Prabhu, Trilochan Prabhu I saw on earlier. If I missed anybody, you please forgive me. My Dandavat Pranam, Vancha Kalpataruvishcha, Kripa Sindhuvevacha, Patitanam Pavanevya Vaishnavevyo Namo Namaha. Jai Radhe Radhe. Some devotees have asked me too why I've chosen to do like this. Part of serving the Harikatava Guru Parampara is both the esoteric ideal and the pragmatic expression. The esoteric ideal, if we're talking about Radha Dasyam, talking from Ujjalinamani, etc., this is the esoteric ideal. And to give inspiration by understanding our sadhya, it will increase the faith and the depth of practice in sadhana. You understand? But if we don't speak the pragmatic ideal, the pragmatic course of life also, which is expressed in these kind of teachings, then it is very possible that sometimes the material energy will come and create an obstacle that we have a hard time negotiating because we're not seeing it from that absolute perspective. You understand? So simply to discuss it amongst each other helps us all to keep top of mind the ability to look at things through that prism, and therefore know that Shastras also backed up what we said and even define the obstacle. You understand? That's the point here. Even define the obstacle. You understand? So that we can give due attention to how to move forward in bhakti over top or around this obstacle. All right, my Dandavat Pranam. Hari Bol.